Kia ora, everyone. Kia ora, everyone. Sorry, welcome to round 3 of Australs. The motion that is being debated by these two teams has an info slide. De-professionalizing student sports may include barring all staff, including coaches and associate administrators, from receiving more than a living wage, pooling all revenue in the league to cover reasonable costs, and donating any profit to a range of non-sports charities. The motion is that student sports should be completely de-professionalized, and I'd like to welcome the first affirming speaker.
Just double checking, all good audio quality wise?
Yep, you're audible.
Thank you very much. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's be clear here, student sports and the status quo of student sports, where most things are partially de-professionalized, are unfortunately always for the benefits of the leagues themselves. As I will make very clear in this speech, unfortunately, the current status quo of student sports leagues leads to the exploitation of these students. It leads to them having negative consequences for their professional sporting careers, but also for many other people who would otherwise have participated in these leagues. It presents a barrier for them to be able to enjoy the sports at the age of being a student. First thing I'm going to do, a bit of setup. What do we think this debate looks like? We're going to say that in reality, student sports in this debate probably speaks to sort of older students. Realistically, this probably means university age students, although, you know, if a negative team wants to say like the oldest age of high school students, or like the last graduating year, maybe that will also count. But we say for the most part, students and the way that student sports needs to be de-professionalized is at those sort of higher ages of groups, right? We're not saying that, and in fact, it's very unlikely that most, if any high school age sports is being sort of put into this debate. We're happy to sort of take that out, right? The other thing to say here is, what does de-professionalization itself look like? I think the info slide fortunately does a bit of a useful job for me, but by and large, it would mean trying to reduce the amount of wages that were paid to these professional coaches. It would ultimately, as the info slide puts, the money would probably be acting in a non-for-profit way. That is to say, the leagues and the teams themselves probably no longer have incentive, and I will explain why this is important later, but they'll obviously no longer have the incentive to have these mass piles of money anymore. And as the info slide also says, you'll probably donate them to charities at some point. Right, okay. Now, let's then talk about, firstly, why is it the case that in the status quo, de-professionalized sports were inherently problematic? The important thing to say here is, I don't think negative can ever stand behind partial de-professionalization, because as I will make clear, inherently, this will always be for the benefit of the leagues, not the students. Few reasons why this is particularly bad. The first thing is short-term interest. Students are only at sporting institutions and colleges and schools and universities for a set amount of years. There is no reason to value the athletes themselves, because each individual athlete is only going to be there for 2 or 3 years. There's no incentive for those institutions to care specifically about athletes as a group, because each individual athlete derives very little benefit. Secondly, often, and unfortunately this is the case, that the kinds of students who go into sports and are particularly good at sports, often these are people of color, often these can be people of lower class backgrounds. The sporting administrators themselves tend to be quite racist, tend to be quite classist, and so do not want to necessarily, at the student level, continue to give more benefits to these people. Thirdly, there is the principle of amateurism. There is a view that sports people who are students should not necessarily be given their benefits because they're amateurs. They shouldn't have to engage in the sports for money, for example. You look at the NCAA in America, they, despite being some of the largest sort of professional organizations outside of the actual students themselves, they often say their students are amateurs, they're not necessarily worthy of significant amounts of money, they shouldn't necessarily have the right to control their likeness, etc. Fourthly, there is no lobbying from students. It is very difficult for students, generally speaking, to have a voice. Collectivization in these sporting institutions very rarely occurs, again, partly because of the fact that students themselves have short-term interest with respect to going pro. And then finally, there is also the pressure that occurs with respect to, given that most of the times the sporting leagues are connected to institutions of education, there is a pressure that comes from taking away the educational opportunity that these people might not otherwise have had access to, which is another barrier to these people, to ultimately the students not speaking up against the exploitation of the sporting leagues. That means, on the whole, de-professionalization has to be complete. Because if it is incomplete, it means that the sporting leagues themselves are still likely to fester a problematic culture. Let's talk about why that even in the world of semi-deprofessionalization, if we never like the culture would still be particularly problematic. And that's mainly because the students are trapped in there. They're trapped in there for three reasons. One, there is a norm around these leagues. Often these leagues are pretty prominent, we have to say, right? Which means that there's an expectation for good athletes to continue to go to these leagues in the first place, right? If you're an American college footballer, you want to go to a college football team in the NCAA because of how important that is to your career. Secondly, obviously, there are a lot more resources that are packed into these semi-professional leagues at the moment, right? So you want to go to the place where all the resources are. That seems pretty intuitive. And then thirdly, because everyone else is going there, you too want to build networks with the best players, with the best coaches that are likely working in these leagues. So we say that if you do not completely deprofessionalize, all the harms of deprofessionalization are likely to fester no matter what negative team wants to counter from. Now let's talk about the benefits of deprofessionalizing and ultimately explaining why it is important to deprofessionalize. The first thing to talk about is health. What we say in the alternative of these leagues, where these people are going to go, is twofold. On the one hand, there are obviously going to be the very elite athletes. We think that it is more likely in the world where student sports are deprofessionalized that these people are going to go towards institutions that are directly connected to the professional leagues. So, for example, the Premier League has a youth division. The NRL has a youth division. Also, the teams themselves might have academies. So, like in the UK, Liverpool, Chelsea, whatever, West Ham, they all have academies that people might go to in lieu of a closer connection, to get a closer connection with the professional sporting league. We say that this is better in terms of health for two reasons. For the health of the pro athlete specifically, for two core reasons. Firstly and foremostly, those professional level leagues are more regulated than the student leagues ever could be for the reasons I explained to you earlier, right? The professional leagues and the professional sporting teams themselves have a far greater incentive to ensure that their number one assets are not completely screwed into the ground. There is also often more regulation because of the public scrutiny that exists far more on those leagues that tends to be more effective because more people tend to watch the bigger leagues than they do the student leagues, notwithstanding the size of the student leagues themselves. But then secondly, even though, as I said earlier, the colleges might have some good infrastructure, often the bigger teams obviously have far better infrastructure. They can employ far more staff. They can employ far more experienced staff. And they're also obviously, the networks within those teams are obviously also better insofar as the more professional coaches tend to obviously go towards the more professional athletes in the league. So for those pro athletes, we say their health is better than they ever could be in those deprofessionalized leagues, which note, I explained to you very clearly they are going to go to in the status quo in a world where there's no deprofessionalization. The second thing to say is we reduce the amount of exploitation of these assets. As I explained earlier, note that the semi-pro leagues are the leagues where often exploitation occurs because the benefits of the league tend to go straight to the league, straight to the sporting teams, never to the students, which means that the students who were the principal source of entertainment in these leagues were never capable of actually gaining the benefits and often at quite significant detriment to them. They had to let go of their education to prioritize the sporting leagues. They often went through brutal training. They had to deal with coaches who probably didn't give two shits about them. Unfortunately, it meant that these students got exploited. We limit that when we start transferring students to the professional leagues. Why? Two reasons. One, because of the closer scrutiny that occurs on those professional sporting teams. If Liverpool FC, Chelsea FC, the New Zealand All Blacks, whoever the case may be, does something that is far more likely to get media attention and far more likely to spur criticism that will ensure that these people are better protected. And then secondly, there's also, again, incentive for these teams now in the academy structure to go directly to these people to try and keep them on board, given all the other professional teams that are likely swarming around them, as opposed to sort of the pathway that the deprofessionalized leagues, the semi-deprofessionalized leagues necessarily give them, because they don't necessarily have to care about that exploitation at a team level. They just care about the end product. Finally, we say that the leagues themselves are probably going to become more enjoyable for the students who otherwise might not have gone pro. There's less pressure on them because there's less corporate attention on them. There's less pressure on them because the incentive of those leagues to try and go pro is inevitably removed now that these other connections are likely to be taken. So we say that even for the people who continue to participate in those leagues, they're probably just going to have a more enjoyable time like you should have in student sports. We get better outcomes for the people who are going to go pro. We get better people for the outcome. We get better outcomes for people who are not going to go pro. So proud to affirm.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the first speaker of the Getting.
Hi, can I be heard? Oh, kind of bright.
Yes, you can be heard.
Kind of a dramatic cast to my face. I'll just turn the lamp off, sorry. Anyway, no pronoun preference and no POI preference. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Neg will advance two main arguments. The first is that this is best for the sport and the well-being of all those involved. And secondly is that professionalism allows for more social good. Before that, setup. a professionalized model of student sports, which is, by the way, our alternative, we're not running some half measure, is a world where all parties involved are compensated and treated as professionals, whether they be athletes, staff, or coaches, and are able to treat this as a full-time job, are able to negotiate their wages and have professional leagues, as well as the pooling of resources and profit internal and not being forced to have that be siphoned off by the amateur league that you're in. Additionally, we also allow profit. And like any other professional, we expect their income to be taxed, just to be clear. Rebuttal. The first claim they have is that this has exploitation in some fashion. So I want to highlight that the claims already analytically on their own are insufficient to prove the outcome of exploitation. Because if you note, they first set up a bunch of disincentives for students to join, and then a bunch of incentives for students to join. Clearly, students have the capacity to decide on their own, especially if they're in college, so they're already adults, whether or not the prominence, resources, and connections are worth the potential harm that some whatever exploitation may offer to you. Note that, secondly, analytically, they also just haven't described what this exploitation looks like. It's not clear how bad this harm is. And in many cases, if it's to the extent where it would be egregious, such as a lack of giving healthcare, this is something that professionalization would be better at fixing because students and staff and schools have the money and resources, as well as the incentive to ensure that this doesn't happen and thus harm their cash cow. The fact is that if there's an incentive to profit in the short term, then this is precisely why they care about the life of these athletes, so that their athletes don't get injured and they can keep them playing while they're in school. The third and last observation I'd make about this case is that as a framing response, the problems with students being minority and amateur are exacerbated when they move to your alternative of the youth version of professional non-student leagues, like youth academies, for the reason that these students are minority, they're amateurs, so they aren't worthy of money, except you create an influx of students leaving these student leagues and going over to the professional alternatives you provided on your side that are not these student leagues, which means that they actually have worse incentives because the competition is present and worsened for these students because they're all flocking. That ends the first response, that exploitation does indeed get worse on your side and is non-existent, at least in the instances where they set it up. The second claim they broadly have is this alternative, which I'll respond to more directly. I have two responses other than the framing response I had earlier. The first response is, it's not clear why this is exclusive. If you could do this already, I don't see why you would stop. And in fact, in most cases, students would prefer to be in like the G League than they would in the student league. In most cases, students don't go to these places because of the fact that they prefer to be able to do school and the professional league that they can consider as their part-time job at the same time. The fact is that they may want to choose to not give up on their college career or their college degree, and at the same time be able to have a half measure of competing so that they know whether or not it's for them, which we think is a better alternative since it allows students more choice and more information before they choose. As a second observation I'd make, the mitigation is simply that in many cases, this is simply not available to you. For many leagues, either they're not skilled enough or because these academies are not willing to take the risk on you. For many students, their alternative is having no professional career, which is just simply deplorable. Having taken that all down, these responses mean, first of all, that their alternatives either make things worse for the people that they talk about, or secondly, that we provide for it better on our side. Argument number one. Here I will talk about, so the claim flow of this first argument is just that running a sports league is massively expensive and de-professionalization inhibits player development and puts players at risk. First of all, so we just make the observation that student sports will always be expensive due to a variety of fixed costs that remain on both sides, like the healthcare costs that you will still have to pay out lots of money for, and like all the training and development that you will still need to hire coaches for that may cost a lot. A sport lacking in funding is one that inhibits player development and puts player at risk, as well as damages the career prospects of these athletes. The first subclaim is that this puts player at risk. Note that a lack of funding can be dangerous, especially for players who play sports where there's a high risk of injury, like football, like rugby. This is particularly dangerous and there's a high likelihood since these are students that don't have the medical equipment professional athletes do and can't condition to the same extent because of academic requirements that take their time. Why does this occur? So we've made the overall logical claim. The three sub-logical reasons for why this happens are, first, because due to de-professionalization, they can only cover reasonable costs. They're unable to pay for expensive additional equipment and good wages to healthcare professionals. Secondly, they're unlikely to pay the best coaches who will instead flock to amateur or professional leagues for adults, since these coaches know also best how to protect their athletes. They lose out on an important source of information and, livelihood, right? So the best college coaches that know how to protect their quarterback in their pocket, know how to load manage basketball players, go to other leagues, which means that players are put in more danger. And thirdly is that there's just very little success motivation for the clubs themselves. If AF is saying the problem is that the clubs or the college sports leagues don't have incentive to protect players, there's even less of a motivation to protect players on AF now, since all revenue is pooled, so there's no reason to try to succeed, since that money will be siphoned off by clubs, which means that if a player gets injured, there's no real care for them. Since there's no reason to care for them, since you'd make the same amount of money anyway. And the overall pool of resources available to the league shrinks dramatically. There's no reason to try and make a profit if the profit gets taken away from you anyway. So the first harm is that this puts players more at risk because the league cares for them less, and also because they're less capable of doing so, even if they wanted to care for them. The second subclaim is that you lack player development. And this engages directly with their claim about whether or not players have better opportunities. Players aren't just talented. They require a lot of personal investment from good coaches in order to ensure they learn and become talented in the future. And by restricting the ability of players to access good coaching, this harms their ability to become prospects in league drafts. Coaches that can correct bad habits and teach important techniques, that can direct you to the right people and help you figure out the path to the pro league, since they've done this many times before, and can make tapes and film to send to recruits and help players find their next team. Maybe this doesn't help the LeBrons of the world, since they probably will get into these leagues anyway, but for players on the cusp of potentially going professional, this damages their career and harms all those who put all their eggs in the professional league basket. The third and last point is that this also incurs personal costs. That is to say, players who still want to develop and gain skills but don't believe their schools give them enough capacity are forced to look outside of their schools or for personal trainers. They just say, oh, well, you can look outside your school for like professional alternatives that are not in the professional student league. The problem is that this could incur a massive potential cost to students who aren't waged, right? Or this causes them to sacrifice things like their schooling or things like their education, which they may value as well for themselves personally. In addition to this, we also think this has a monetary cost in that you're forced to take on these things without necessarily knowing whether or not these services are actually good themselves. As such, at the end of this first argument, the impact of students is quite large because it means that they're more at personal risk, which outweighs pretty much everything else that they've had in affirmative. Additionally, we've also had substantially more harm in terms of the development of these students' personal careers and athletic careers in their own lives. The second point is that professionalism allows for more social good. The point on this is that student leagues massively bleed revenue on AF and become far less appealing to audiences in their world, which leads to less money for schools. The quality of the sport degrades because players are unequipped, the best coaches leave, and talent is constantly being drained. Games are unsafe, nobody will want to watch. Secondly, they also decrease market reach, which means that because merchandise sales are no longer done at the profitable level, but only to break even, you can't reinvest the profits into holding new leagues and televising the games and holding promotional events. And thirdly is that you lose the sponsors needed to host the games and grow the sport in the first place. You either disallow sponsors entirely because of de-professionalization, or they lose attraction to the game because of decreasing quality, which means for their side, revenue massively diminishes. And the comparative is that on our side, the excess revenue is far greater. On the scale already present in professionalized student leagues like the NCAA Football League or men's basketball is in the millions for most colleges, where the sport attracts hundreds of thousands of fans all across the country to buy tickets, merchandise, and watch content. In our world, excess revenue is far greater and reinvested into the school, into programs to do far more social good like sports scholarships and foundations, talent search programs that expand impoverished communities, and things like healthcare professional paying their wages and so on. This is the comparative likely, one, because the scholarships give the school even more revenue and thus there's an incentive to do it, but beyond that, two, that the pressure to schools is present to give back to the community in the same way that it is on affirmative, and that even if it wasn't, there's far more income that goes back to society via taxes that are far more efficiently spent by the state. I don't know, for like economies of scale. At the end of the speech on neg, it is quite clear. It is better for sports, it is better for students, it is better for schools, and that's why the ballot for neg is clear.
Thank you very much. Second opponent.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Perfect. All the reasons that the negative team wanted to tell you about how students are going to get good healthcare and good coaching and good whatever are all going to be true under our side as well, except they'll actually go to youth academies or to minor league baseball programs or to NBA G League programs that actually have their long-term interests in mind. Not just exploiting them as cash cows for a year to like kick them off into the sunset, but rather are interested in their long-term development because their ultimate aim is to make them good professionals in that particular sport. We get all those benefits about good investment and good care. We do it in a more productive and in a way that actually leads to benefits for these people in the long term. I'm going to do three things in this speech. I'm first going to discuss whether professionalism is good. I'm next going to talk about the alternative of professional sport. I'm lastly going to talk about entertainment. Let's firstly look at these college programs right now and how they're going to be constituted. Firstly, they try to counterprop and say, well, we're going to have full professionalism without actually mechanizing why that's going to happen. And we previously gave you reasons why that was incredibly unlikely to occur under the status quo. We told you, one, they are often just racist and don't believe often Black athletes deserve money. Secondly, they have a financial motive not to pay them. Thirdly, they have this principle of amateurism, which is a justification for paying those athletes. Fourthly, they say, well, you get an education, that's a justification for you not getting paid. And lastly, it's just empirically true. The NCAA and other similar sports like that just don't pay their players. Those are all reasons which were completely ignored by the first negative speaker, and we still say stand, and we're unlikely to get full professionalism. But of course, I'll be charitable, thinking at their best. Let's assume that they actually are able to get some form of professionalism. Let's address their case in this instance. Firstly, they tell us that students have a revealed preference to go to college because they do so in the status quo, but they ignore all the mechanisms again we give you at Karthik to tell you why students are essentially coerced to this choice. Firstly, there's social pressure to go to colleges. In America, everyone talks about which college you're going to go to, which college you're going to commit to. There's a big process that it seems like that's a normal thing to do. Secondly, those colleges have a monopoly on resources right now because they have all this money. That changes under our side, and we remove their ability to earn that money, and these students are more likely to go to things like youth academies and minor leagues. Thirdly, there is a symbiotic relationship between the professional leagues and things like the NCAA. And what the NCAA has done is this lobby consistently over time for those leagues to raise their draft ages. So in the NBA, it's 19, and in the NFL, it's 21. And what that means is students are forced to do in the NBA 1 year, in the NFL 3 years of college before they can actually earn a living in that sport, which essentially means that they have no choice but to go to those colleges under the status quo. But fourthly, and really importantly, there's network effects, because if all the other good prospects have to do a year of college before they can go to the professional league, if you want to develop and play against the best talent, you too have to go to college. So you don't actually have any choice in the status quo. You're forced to do it. And that's something that's incredibly damaging. The next thing they say is, okay, well, we're going to be able to get professionalism that fixes all these problems. Firstly, note what we tell you at Karthik, which is that these colleges have you for a short amount of time. So yes, they want to develop you, and yes, they want to make you be healthy, but not in a way that's actually productive for your long-term well-being, because they only have you for a limited amount of time. So for example, they're more willing to play you in a match when you have an existing injury if you are able to guide your team to winning that match, but it might cause long-term injury later on that derails the rest of your career. So for example, if you play on like a torn meniscus in your knee, they tell you about why healthcare is going to be so good under their side. Firstly, healthcare is going to be great under our side too. We take these kids to youth academies and those type of things which are already discussed. Secondly, in the alternative role that you remove all professionalization from these sports, they're still going to be looking after the safety of their players. Just because you only don't have people being paid millions of dollars, that doesn't mean they're not being looked after. If things like the shoot shield with the UNSW rugby team plays, they're still have physiotherapists look after the students. They're not just throwing them into the fire. And I guess the other important thing to know here is that de-professionalizing it changes the nature of the relationship between the organization and the players. It's no longer about profit and winning as much as you can. It's about people who actually like that sport because they could earn more money elsewhere in professional league as like a physiotherapist as a coach, but they work in that amateur league because they care about the students, because they care and have a passion for that program. Which they're likely doing it because they actually care about the players wanting to succeed in a way that means they're more likely to care about their health and care about their long-term well-being rather than choosing them as cash cows to make as much money as possible or to be as successful in the short term as possible. That's an incredibly important mechanism for us. Then they say, well, we'll get so much revenue under our side, like beautiful, beautiful rivers of golden honey to fund the university. Firstly, that money just goes to the coaches. They go see like Nick Saban in Alabama earns $8 million a year, which is just a ludicrous sum. That's not the exception, by the way. Secondly, yes, you can give scholarships, but who are you going to give scholarships to? The best students who are going to be successful in their professional sport anyway and going to get paid around you money in their career anyway. Those students don't really need that help. It's like Zion Williamson needs extra money. But no, they're not actually, scholarships aren't money. They're just a free education, which these kids don't even need because they're going to become a professional athlete anyway. And they don't care about college. The last thing they said is like, oh, these kids want to go to college. No, they don't. They go to college because they have to. They don't attend their classes. They get barely enough grades to pass the course. They get people to cheat for them. This is like a very famous thing in American sports. They don't need this because they know they're going to be making millions of dollars later on. Why would they care about college? That's all incredibly important. What it means at the end of the day is, firstly, they never established professionalism. They just were incredibly assertive there. But even taking their best case scenario, their system does not work. It does not improve outcomes. And they do not explain why the current system gets any worse right now. But what's the alternative? We tell you it's better for these students to go to professional sports. What is the biggest benefit here that they completely ignore? these students get paid, and they get paid a lot of money. But secondly, they get way better training because they're actually in the professional environment. If you think these colleges have a lot of resources right now, that's nothing against the incredibly wealthy teams or professional leagues. But secondly, they get changed in the proper way of the sport. There's actually very significant differences between college sport and professional sport. For example, the NCAA three-point line is shorter than the college line. Sorry, than the professional line. Which means that these players learn it, like do three throws, relearn that when they get to professional sports. Why train them to deliberately wrong rules? There's other different rules, like things like charges and, you know, the way you can set in the 3-second area and in the key, blah, blah, blah. It's not important. Anyway, these academies are going to be a lot better. Now, what are their criticisms of these academies? They firstly tell you, so in sort of contradictory ways, A, they're going to take too many people, so it's not necessarily guaranteed you're going to succeed, but also they won't take enough, so it ruins people's careers and don't get in. Note the tension in that case. What we say is likely to happen is likely to be quite permissible when people in, because they are likely to obviously want to get the biggest range of talent so they can pick the winners and therefore allow them to succeed. The people who go to these academies and don't make it to the absolute top still have ample careers out there. For example, if you don't make it to the NBA, you can still play in the NBA G League and make like $150,000 every year. That's still a good career. Yes, it's not the life of a superstar, but it's perfectly respectable. And often they often get things like coaching programs in high schools, professional training programs, physiotherapy. There's a lot of avenues you can pursue. It's not like your life is over if you don't make it. But again, most people actually do make it because they're the best players. Okay. The last point I'm going to make is about entertainment. So we'll talk about entertainment in two contexts. Firstly, the professional sport, and then the colleges. First, the professional sport gets way better. Instead of having talents like Zion Williamson, like once-a-generation talent, waste away in college for a year, play against subpar opposition, get them to play in the actual leagues, and they get better development, they get better like physically looked after. Remember how Zion Williamson was treated terribly at Duke, and his body's never recovered from that. But also, it's more important these young stars play in the big leagues, because that's where there's the bigger audience, especially international audiences. Like, yes, the NCAA is big in America, but it's not big internationally. And that means you get more entertainment for the fans. You get to have the best players playing in the biggest markets. But secondly, college becomes better. Right now, college is incredibly unfun for all involved. There's just a bunch of one and done to destroy the rest of the athletes. And the one and done's like the future Zion Williamsons and LeBron James of the world versus a bunch of like future accountants. That's obviously not a very equal battle. Right. And then after you get rid of these people, you get people who actually are there, you get more level playing field, which is more competitive sports. You get people who are more invested in the sport, on the college, not just there for 1 year, they're there for the whole career, which means that you get better college entertainment. At the end of the speech, you get better entertainment, you get a better professional sport leagues, and you get better college sports. For those reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the second negating speaker.
Hello, can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
All right, wonderful. One moment. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I quite like how the AF team clashes, and therefore I think it's fairly simple what the road to victory for OP is. I.e., we have to explain why leagues will not exploit their athletes and their incentives to care for them, and then we have to trash the counterfactual. And in extension, I'll actually explain why you have somewhat of a black market for how you wage staff in their world. Because when NFL players right now aren't currently waged, it exists in the form of boosters giving things like cars, paying for dinners, and I'd say that's a far worse world on their side of the house because it's unchecked and unregulated in that side for everybody now, for league coaches, for league staff, etc. So the main claim from Gov is that these leagues don't care about you, and that going to other big leagues is better because they'll care about you more. Firstly, there are many reasons these leagues will care about you. Number one, many of the problems they have with their leagues are solved by professionalization, i.e., you have a view that it's amateurish, they have a lot of racist coaches. The first one you solve by ensuring that the big lights, the big names, the ability to broadcast it on a professional level, the ability for players to engage with professionals who have a history in the league and institutions in the league, are therefore more likely to make them seem professional rather than ones that are coached by like whoever's uncle is willing to work that kind of job. But secondly, in terms of the most well-paid coaches are probably those who have a history of working with players of different backgrounds, are the most likely to be rewarded for not being racist and making the best decisions because of skill and talent, not out of who they think is better because of their identity, are also the ones that are likely to be paid well and will instead go to the professional leagues if they are not paid sufficiently. Therefore, these problems are immediately solved. But I think the more clever argument is on short-termism. I have two responses here. The first is that you might have a short-term view of the player, but you have a long-term view of your sports program. So if a lot of other promising high school athletes see your program and say, if I go there, they will injure me. If I go there, there is no promise that I'll make it to an NBA team. And it's unlikely they go there to begin with, which is why Duke always tells you how many NBA players are drafted from their team per year, which is why that was the problem, actually, I note with Zion Williamson as the second response. 4 years is like a pretty substantial amount of time. And what I note here is that if you are going to sacrifice a player's health in order to make sure you increase their on-court product, that actually is against your incentive, insofar as they can threaten to go to this professional league after that, because now they have the best performance of their lives, even if they don't know, like if the scouts don't know about their underlying health issues. It's much more likely they threaten to leave your team, because that's when their stock is at their highest, when their health has been compromised the most, and when they're most likely to perform well. I'd say coaches actually have the opposite incentive. In order to ensure that you stay, you don't want to over-exaggerate a player's value and still want to take care of them for the 4 years. Otherwise, they will become a one-and-done like Zion Williamson. I think Duke knows that they made a mistake here by sacrificing his health. He instead went to the NBA after 1 year because everyone thought he'd be so good and ended up getting substantially injured. I don't think this short-termism is as clear as they say of simply 1 year. And therefore, these are substantial incentives for leagues to care about their players. But why is the counterfactual much worse? Because at best they say you want to invest in these people because you have a long-term incentive in them. I don't think that's true for many reasons. The first is that this incentive is not equal to capacity, i.e., these leagues are not very rich. You're talking about the NBA G League, you're talking about some youth academies, you're talking about amateur, professional, and minor league baseball, which I would like to note that in comparison to college sports, which is seen as both the future of professional leagues, or also the fact that it taps into a really wide market of college students, as well as all the college alum who want to cheer for all the people that they saw and the schools that they were part of, versus these leagues which are seen as the second tier, third tier, fourth tier leagues. Name one guy who watches the NBA G League. I don't think you can. Versus a lot of people who end up watching college sports precisely because it taps into a specific youth market, as well as all the older people that are involved in these schools. So therefore, even if they have the incentive to invest in the long term, it's not clear whether they have the money and ability to do so, when for all the $1 million they say Nick Saban has, I'd say that's a lot of dollars as well that you're able to provide for these schools. Secondly, it's more competition, i.e., within college sports, it's a bunch of young athletes who are trying to become promising and make it big. I would say for the minor leagues, the G leagues, etc., it's not as easy because there are a lot of people there. Not just all these young athletes. You have older players who somewhat retired but are trying to make it back into the league. You have injured players like Klay Thompson who are using the G League just as a way of them being able to condition themselves and get back on the Golden State Warriors. You have foreign players who are trying to make it into America through these different minor leagues and work their way up. You are a college student who might be 16, 17, 18, or rather, no, a bit older than that. But it's much more difficult for you to compete with these players, which means less playing time for you to develop your skills, which means you're a lot more disposable to these different leagues and teams because they know they can get somebody else, that someone else is waiting on the rungs, and it's not clear why you had that long-term incentive to begin with. They never explained this. Thirdly, not everyone is Zion Williamson, which means that if you're the fifth best person on a college sports team, it means that you kind of have to make a decision. Maybe pro sports is not for you, but being able to continue with your scholarship, play for the entirety of 4 years, be good enough to stay on the team, but at the same time pursue a degree, might be an important decision people have to make. And a lot of the time, making it into a D1 school is not just good for your sports career, but good for your education insofar as maybe they wanted you to support and complement the star player that'll make it pro, but you yourself might not be cut out for it. And this ability to save yourself in the instance that you cannot pursue this kind of sports career and instead have a college degree and work, could be quite substantial. I don't think they ever contend with this. They just say that they're forced to do it when a lot of players are given that option. Lastly, I don't think they ever contend with development. Firstly, for guys like Zion Williamson, the problem with immediately entering the league is it's very difficult for you to know what it's like to lead a team. I.e., maybe when you start in the league, you're going to have very few minutes. You're not going to get much playing time. You're going to play behind the best players of the team. And therefore, it's very difficult for you to meld into that role of being the star player. Versus when you have had some experience in college already when you were the best, and therefore kind of know what it's like to lead the helm. That's good for development. But secondly, that just assumes a lot of players on their side will make the pro cut immediately. But what we explain at David is that sometimes you need the right guidance and coaching in order to do that. Sometimes you need to know what it's like to work within a team before you can make it to a pro team. Sometimes you still don't even know what your role is. Are you playing wide receiver? Are you playing tight end? Are you gonna play quarterback or any other of these roles? You can't experiment like that in a professional league. That's risky. But you might be able to do that for a college that needs to be able to fulfill different positions. So for all these reasons, we're better for players who enter these colleges. We're also better in the instance you cannot enter these. And I'd say the counterfactual is one they at best say there's a long-term incentive for. We debunk that claim quite substantially. Extension. So what happens in college leagues is that these people aren't waged for players. I would say you move that to coaches. And therefore, there are a lot of behind the scenes ways of being able to entice people. You pay for fancy dinners, you give them cars, and it's very difficult to be able to ascertain what is a personal favor, what is a personal gift, what is something you just want to do out of your own goodwill versus one that is part of a contract. The problem with this is, one, it leads into a lot of the same harms that they explain of maybe people being exploited, of these people still being paid way too much as they point out on their side of the house. But two, is that this is not very useful for the people who are on the receiving end of it because they might not want that car. Maybe they prefer a wage they can feed their family rather than the fancy dinners that are being offered to them. But thirdly, is that it's just a lot more difficult for leagues to be able to regulate, oversee, and monitor, which therefore means that in the instance that you're spending money in this fashion, all the harms of potentially having college coaches act maliciously for all the reasons that they say, or people still wanting to enter the league, might still accrue. But they happen in ways that are far more difficult to regulate and monitor. They happen in ways that are not a very legitimate form of exchange because these are not mandated by labor laws. These are not people can't turn this into a living wage and feed their families, but might be okay with it enough to be able to accept it as bribes, but come off as personal favors. So in the instance that this is true, the amount of exploitation, the amount of inability for leagues to remain equal amongst their players or their teams is still likely to occur on their side of the house, and therefore all the harms still accrue. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. Third affirmative.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
All right, thank you. The opposition's countermodel of complete professionalization completely misses the problem because now, at the point you turn college into a completely professional league, the true professional leagues like the NFL and the NBA have no reason to let those college leagues compete against them or to take the younger players. What happens currently, as we explained to First Affirmative, is that the NBA has an agreement with the college leagues that players and talent will most likely go to those college leagues. There is a financial agreement. And the NBA, you can tell they've done that because they have raised the draft age. Like professional leagues, for example, raise draft ages such that you have to do a year at college before you go into the NBA. At the point you make college a totally professional league, the G League, the subsidiary, the minor league baseball, minor league football, the academies, those will become bigger leagues. They will expand them. More players will want to go to them. There will be more money available from publicizing and putting those games on television. So that is the change that would happen. They would expand those leagues, more players would go to them, and there is no reason to allow amateurs to go to college because they are no longer amateurs going to college. They are professionals going to a professional sports league, which is competing with them in terms of money. That is the key thing that I think the negative team have quite clearly missed. I'm going to talk about, mainly just one issue on outcomes for athletes, and then very briefly, if I have time, on the social good. In terms of outcomes for athletes, let's begin here by reestablishing the context, which I think the negative team quickly dismisses. They say that amateur leagues are not very rich currently, and that would change with professionalization. But as we have explained, what will happen is not that college leagues will turn professional and get more money flowing into them. It is that they will now become a lower tier league. Currently, they can corner the market of people who are 18 to 21. Now, they cannot do so because they are in competition with the G League, for example, and that means they will actually be a C tier league. They will earn far less money. And the simple reason for this, which is also a response to the black market argument we hear at Second Negative, is that people will now never choose to go to an amateur league under our world. They will or a completely de-professionalized league. They will always opt to go to a G League because Firstly, they would have done that anyway if they were allowed to. The reason preventing them is simply that the draft age was too high. Secondly, it has closer ties to the professional leagues, which is obviously something which is extremely appealing to those people. Thirdly, you have a better guarantee of making money because those leagues literally are billions of dollars richer than what would be the comparative for a college league which turns professional. And also, fourthly, there will be more scouts in those leagues because there will be the presumption in a positive feedback loop that more talent is going to those professional G leagues, and that means that more good players are going there and then more good players will go there so that the scouts would pick them up. That is why no one, if they could, would actually pick an amateur league in the first place. So what are there, I guess, big effective responses to our claims? The first thing they say is that, well, this only applies under our world. People would only be able to go to a G League or something like that if they were on the cusp of missing the professional league. So people under their world would be able to go to these like professional college leagues if they were on the cusp of making the pros, and this would be like a middle house for them to go. Firstly, there is no reason why giving these people a 3-year professional contract when the odds are it is extremely unlikely they will make a professional league, given all people who've made a professional league are already in the G League or a minor professional league, is a good thing. You lose out on opportunities. You bank your entire future on an extremely short-term outcome that might not happen. That is an obvious harm that would occur to them because they will not make a professional league. The odds are far against them, despite what they may believe. But secondly, this will just happen in better professional leagues, right? Because what they say is that there will be a massive influx of players to these like G leagues, minor league football, minor league baseball, and that will actually like symmetrically make all the harms occur. But what we have told you is that they would adapt, they would expand, they would allow more players to play in those leagues, they would make it a more televised thing. Like the G League would be televised, they would buy TV slots for it because they know that this is where the young talent for the NBA actually is. They obviously have incentives to do that. So the influx would not actually hurt because the professional leagues clearly have the like economic liquidity to adapt to an influx of players and make it economically beneficial to them. What the difference then is between these two worlds is that firstly, in these minor leagues, it is run by professional athletes or at least coaches who are part of professional leagues, which means there is less racism and there is less potential for that kind of discrimination. Secondly, they still have fewer like long-term incentives for the simple reason that you no longer have that person for 3 years. G League teams, minor league football teams, and minor league baseball teams are subsidiary of the like major pro team, which means that they would want to draft that person if they were good enough into their pro team, so they don't want them to get injured. And thirdly, they just have more money. They earn millions of dollars of more money, which means it's far more beneficial for player development. They then say that pro leagues are going to be the pro leagues that they create are going to be good for athletes in terms of the fact that like you would be able to get better coaches or where they would otherwise go to the pros. The good coaches will still go to the pros. They are billions of dollars richer. There are only like 30 really or like 90 head coaching positions available in the entirety of North America in professional leagues. Obviously, there is a lot of talent. If there are like the same people would still go to the same big leagues just because there is so much more money in those big leagues in the first place. What we tell you is then that as amateur athletes, you would choose to go to a league which has the incentives which are better off for you, whereas in these other pro athletic leagues, the same problems would still apply. Because if it is a league that is so much smaller than other professional leagues, and if it is a league that like doesn't make as much money and is not the league that players would want to go to as their first preference, then you can still exploit the athletes because they have no bargaining power and because they believe they are lucky to be there and because they are desperate to be able to make the pros, which is something we tell you that it is statistically very unlikely that they will do in the first place. They say, well, Duke will administrate this well, or like will advertise how well they're going to get players into professional leagues well. They won't. They now desperately need players because everyone would prefer a G League contract instead. So that means that like the pro leagues have wiped out all the talented players. So they need to actually directly misadvertise their position to ensure players go to their teams. Then they say, well, if you have good performances in lower leagues, it still means you can make a professional league. No, because now you'll be seen as playing against weaker competition. Yes, you might put up good statistics, but those statistics will be seen in the context of players who are far worse than if you were in a minor professional league. At the age of 18, if you are not on track of making a professional league, most scouts simply do not believe that you can make it, and they mostly ignore you and do not even listen to you. What do they say are the comparative benefits of making these amateur leagues professional? They say that you can get more healthcare, but like obviously, as we have told you, they are probably going to be cash poor. There is no reason that, yes, everything is completely professionalized, but this league is desperate for money. This league still has those same bad incentives. It doesn't mean just because you're now a professional athlete, you are obliged to make a contract which is anywhere near as the coaches. They provided no mechanisms or analysis why that was true. they said, I've already rebutted their stuff about how the best coaches will still, or good coaches will still be, better coaches will still go to these minor leagues. That will not happen. They'll still all go to the professionals. They say that they will have motivation to protect these athletes, but the athletes are still on a short-term contract, and the athletes would also know that these leagues don't have an incentive to protect them because they're only there for 3 years. They would go to the G League if they could. If they are forced to go to this other league, they would probably be more aware of that and more skeptical of how safe it would actually be for them. They say that you can make more money. You can make more money in a bigger league because they actually have more money available. All of the benefits that we provided then were not actually things as is suggested by the first negative that were minor and vague. It was your health. It was your knees being treated as if they can run out over the course of 3 years because they do not need you for a long-term career. It is your mental health being neglected. It is not getting any guaranteed money whatsoever, whereas on our side, you are at least guaranteed to get more money in a professional league. And that means even if you don't make it professional, you have some money in the bank. That is an enormous benefit. That is why I'm proud to offer.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the third negative speaker.
Hi, I'm going to assume I'm audible. If there's anything wrong, just tell me. Yeah.
You're audible.
Great. Start in 3, 2, 1. I am genuinely baffled by this affirmative team's case because they claim to care about student exploitation. And by the end of this, what they actually do is force students to either give up on their dreams or forsake their education entirely. I want to talk about 2 issues in this speech. First, on the welfare of student athletes, and second, on the benefit of the league, the coaches, staff, and audiences that this team just conveniently neglects as a non-important stakeholder. Before any of that, I want to clarify our counterfactual because we stand behind full professionalization, which allows athletes to make more than a living wage and have a comfortable life. Their one response down the bench is to say, oh, you can't do that, leagues are greedy. 3 things. 1, counter fiat. If you have the will to erase all their ability to make profit, we probably have the will to instate regulations like paying your students a decent amount. 2, as we explained from David and Mikko, there's an incentive to attract best students to make the most money. You have to pay them salaries because you want to attract sponsors. You want them to go to your school. You want to compete with NBA and professional leagues, which you guys say are an alternative for many of these students. So the existence of your counterfactual proves why students have leverage in our world and proves why conditions for them aren't actually that bad in the professionalized world we explain, which is why Third Aft's response of, oh, there's no incentive for the NBA to take them on clearly doesn't work. First of all, they graduate, so the NBA will still have to take them on eventually. But furthermore, it's that competitive dynamic between the 2 types of leagues which guarantees these students a decent life. That means, before going into the issues, there is a massive burden on AF to demonstrate A, why minor leagues are able to expand to such an extent that they can supersede college leagues entirely, and B, why the same exploitative structures, racist coaches, and terrible things they claim exist in college leagues don't migrate to amateur leagues when they do expand. That brings me nicely into the first issue on the welfare of student athletes. There are 2 groups of athletes under consideration. First, the elites who could go to amateur leagues, the alternative they defend, and second, the vast majority of athletes who remain in uni leagues, either because they simply can't make the cut or because they're unsure about their career prospects and their decision to commit to a professional life of sports at this point in time. Let's first talk about elite players. And I think despite the assertions they give you that minor leagues will be able to expand to such a great extent, this is likely to be the majority and the minority. And the reason for that is they never explain why these leagues would get the attention we specifically name, which is people which are likely to watch college sports. The analysis isn't transferable to minor leagues because the reason people watch college sports, as we illustrate from Mikko, is because of the unique connection these people have with the sport, their associations with their university. That simply doesn't exist, and you don't attract that same audience when you migrate these people to minor leagues. What does that mean then for their case? If these minor leagues are as attractive as they say, the question you have to ask is why players still choose to go to college. Answer: life in these leagues simply isn't as great as AF's glorified delusion, and that's for a couple of reasons. First, there's no fallback. There's no life after the sport and injury. Even in their most uncharitable characterization of student athletes, where they just don't go to class, at least you have a degree. At least you're able to market yourself if ever the life of sports doesn't work out for you. At least you're able to make connections outside the sport and still maintain the life that you can turn back to. Second, there's a much higher barrier to success in these leagues. Everyone is more talented. You are competing with the cream of the crop. It is much harder for you to get noticed It's unlikely that you as an individual player have any say whatsoever in what you get. 3, the fact that you're locked in at a young age. Many of these people don't want to commit to a life of full-time sports. They're not yet sure what position they want to play. They want to experiment. They want to try different things, as many young people do. That is a capacity you erase entirely when you force them to only be able to chase their dreams by giving up on their education. But even if you don't believe any of that, I would suggest that these minor leagues and these sports academies actually get worse when students don't have an alternative that they can use to gain leverage over these minor leagues. Because AF doesn't really provide you any sufficient reasons to believe that these leagues are better regulated or policed, either than to assert that they aren't because they don't make profit. If you believe they're counterfactual, that these leagues become more profitable, presumably the same exploitative structures move into those leagues. The coaches that want to exploit students go into them. What's the analysis and what's the thing that stops that from happening in status quo is the fact that students have a choice between amateur leagues and between college leagues. The fact that there's an alternative and that they can threaten to leave at any time, which means that on our side, even though small minority of elites are better off and they're doomed to exploitation in their world. Secondly, then, on the majority of players who will be stuck or who will continue to compete in college leagues. Their claim essentially is that students have no leverage in college leagues. First, look at all of Mikko's responses via short-termism and the incentives to build a good program all of time, to attract more students and to appeal to sponsors, all of which only exist when athletes bring in profit that can be reinvested into the program. Secondly, note, they don't explain why any of this changes in the comparative. If you believe a large number of students will still be competing in college leagues in their world because amateur leagues don't expand to such a great extent, we explain that life for them gets substantially worse. Their leverage further decreases when they're no longer a source of profit, and if anything, they're just a cost to the university. That even if players are exploited on our side, at least they have an income and skill which serves as a cushion to that exploitation. They can threaten to move schools. They're able to stop playing because they made more than a living wage and they can pay off their student debt or actually have something to fall back on. What you are comparing that to is all of our analysis coming from David, which they just glibly respond to. It's not just about healthcare. It's about development. It's about your ability to chase the sport without feeling a threat to your life, without having to give up your personal life, while being able to pursue both the opportunities given to you by college and the opportunities given to you in this professional sport without ever having to forsake one over the other. So we think by shrinking this alternative for many people, they doom them to a far worse life. And we win the issues on both types of students. Let's secondly then talk about the league, coaches, staff, and audiences. And I think throughout this debate, AF is just dismissive. I don't think it's fair to say that all of these people are greedy and racist. Many of them do care about the players. Many of them give their lives to help them develop and see them grow. Many of them are students that care about, or were students themselves that care about the health and well-being and ought to be compensated fairly, to which AF just says, screw them, they're exploitative and they hate students. What happens in their world and why does life get far worse for these people? First, the best talent is forced to move out to other leagues or forced to cope with a life where they cannot sustainably be involved in student sports. That means the students that are left behind, which are the majority, as we say, in college leagues because they don't make the cut for pro leagues, are left with the worst and most exploitative coaches that lack the skill they have, which feeds into Mikko's argument about how this creates a black market for coaching, where you get more exploitative conditions because a lot of the things students have to do to access the best talent is under the table. Secondly, the quality of the game just degrades. And I want to be clear about how important this is. This means students, coaches, and teams don't have equipment to work with. They have to work in decrepit gyms. They can't turn out. The games aren't as exciting for fans. People are turned away from the sport entirely, which means they don't watch and you don't create a sustainable environment. If you are unconvinced as to what the lives of athletes will look like on either side, this issue wins us the debate because we demonstrate that for everyone else who is not an athlete, even if you believe conditions for them for athletes are currently bad, conditions deteriorate to the point where they can no longer feasibly be involved in the sport. But finally, for audiences and fans, we say the game just becomes far less enjoyable because they're not able to make that connection, that same connection they currently have with college leagues. Because instead of watching a game that they can root for because of their personal life experience, they're watching a game of people who are shunted into amateur leagues and watching the same exploitative structures play out anyways because that's where they move to. For all of those reasons, negate.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the neg reply.
Hello, can I be heard?
Sorry, you're very soft, Mikko.
Okay. Is this better?
Yes, that's a bit better. Is that okay for everyone else?
Yeah, I just want to make sure.
It is actually quite quiet still
Okay.
for me.
Yeah, it's
I'm gonna try unplugging and plugging in my mic. I'll be back.
easy.
Hello, is this any better?
Yep, that's good for me. Is it good for everyone else?
Much better, at least for me.
All right. Thank you so much. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the app strategy has been to explain that an amateur league or going pro is a lot better than going to college sports. There are two things to note here. The first is that for any student who isn't certain about going pro, or for anyone that values their education, all the harms David explains of a lack of funding are going to accrue for this set of people. And I think at best, app says at least they're having fun. I don't think that is a sufficient response to the harms of a lack of player development, the injuries that are likely to occur, and therefore all the harms of any college athlete that will exist on their side of the house. The winning claims in this debate are ones that just assume people immediately migrate to these pro leagues. When we say there are many players who are only on the cusp of being on that kind of professional sports, might need a few years and might not want to risk it, this is a substantial group of people that I think immediately goes to negative bench. But secondly, I want to compare the state of these amateur leagues versus the college sports that we support instead. They say that there's an incentive for exploitation. We counter and say that there are disincentives for exploitation. I will weigh these claims later. But the first thing I want to note are there are inherent differences in the league that I think they are unable to respond to substantially. Firstly is wealth, i.e., they just claim that there are billions and billions of dollars still in these leagues when we say that is unlikely to be the case. I want to note the difference in the quality of analysis here. Their presumption is that when the players move, the billions and dollars of moves as well. When what we explain is that college sports uniquely taps into a market of people that are well connected to their colleges, of universities that they're well acquainted with, members of, alum of, and interact with on a regular basis. And therefore, that's why a lot of these leagues are seen and supported by many people. Moreover, because these are all young and promising players, they are often seen as the future of these leagues. So as a consequence, their inability to explain why an NBA G League, where players make the fractions of what an NBA player would make, are those that have the same kinds of infrastructure to support the same expansions they would want to assess. But secondly, their claim a third affirmative of at least you can expand the league does not respond to our claim of a greater amount of competition, i.e., you are a young player, and now you suddenly have to compete with stars that are trying to make it back, with stars that might have just been recently injured and are trying to recover, or foreign players that are quite promising, have experience in their own professional leagues and want to make it here. As a consequence, what this proves is that it's much more difficult to make it, but moreover, is it debunks their claim of you have a long-term incentive in these players, because you can't possibly have a long-term incentive of every single player. In fact, this greater amount of competition not only means there is a harder form of development because you lose minutes, you lose the ability to play, but it also means you're far more disposable and therefore shifts these same incentives for development that they claim to be true. But thirdly, a lot of their incentives, I think we have better reasons for a couple of reasons. The first is that a lot of them are just generalizations about the nature of this college, like football, college basketball programs, without a sufficient structural reason to work behind them, i.e. they are racist, i.e. they are amateurish. When what we explain is that the ability to have institutions within these programs, the ability to fairly compensate the people who will be administrators and staff are far more likely to push them against this and therefore are unlikely to lead to that claim, since the ability to make good decisions not on the basis of racism probably is going to make you a good coach. But secondly, I'd also want to note there's shifting characterizations here in how we win both. I.e., if you claim that the NBA, or rather that there are deals between college sports and the professional leagues that allow you to trap this market into you first, that this proves their claim of a short-term incentive. And actually what we claim here is you have a long-term incentive both for your program, because if players see that people go into your program are always getting injured, not likely to have good career prospects, I don't know why they'll join. But moreover, it also explains that sacrificing player health for an immediate on-the-court product might ensure that they leave instead, because you have shown the best possible versions of that player and therefore are willing to risk injury for them, and therefore they threaten to leave your program. So as a consequence, wanting to keep them on for the main 4 years in which they will reside is probably what's better for these players and better for you as a coach as well. And therefore we win. On the first context that I think they have no responses to, and as well as on the second context where they have generalizations about the structures of these leagues, but not much structural reason to provide incentive or characteristics. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome the affirming leader.
Still all good audio-wise? Yep, okay, thank you.
Yes, carry on.
All right, amazing. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Quite evidently, the important question in this debate, and I would argue one that both teams spend most of their time on, is on the question of student athletes and whether or not outcomes get better in a world where they are no longer tied and tethered to the exploitative professional semi-pro leagues of college, or whether they are able and now incentivized to go to the better leagues. The important thing that we tell you right from the top throughout our speeches is that college sports is inherently exploitative. As we explained, even if negative can counterprop full professionalization, throughout second, third, and first, we explain why the structures of college sport inherently limit the extent to which athletes are cared about. They're only there for a few years, they're seen as amateurs, and often the institutions of college in and of themselves are biased against treating these athletes who often come from poor racial and class backgrounds in a positive light. That changes when, as we explain, now the sports become de-professionalized at the college level, which means, as we explicitly explain, the professional lower tier leagues, so the academies, the G League, whatever you want to talk about, were now going to be where these people went. We explain very clearly, contrary to what Negative says, why this was likely to occur, namely because all the better scouts, all the better coaches, all the better players now as well, given the networking effects, were likely to go there. The reason that this is important in this debate is ultimately when Negative doesn't explain why it was the case that professionalization, or rather doesn't adequately respond to these reasons as to why these athletes were likely to end up going to these leagues where they were likely to be paid more, they were likely to receive better training and less exploitation. It is inherently problematic to explain, or for that side, to ultimately have these students stay stuck in leagues where they were coerced to joining in the first place, where they were not likely to get substantial amounts of benefits, as we explained. So we explained firstly why the leagues were likely to be better. Let's talk about college leagues. The first thing and sort of the primary thing they try and suggest is that these college leagues were not as bad as we explained. However, I would strongly contest this characterization. Again, as I said earlier in this reply, it is the case that often these leagues are exploitative. But importantly, because of these short-term incentives that we inherently remove on side affirmative by incentivizing these people to go elsewhere, rather than be coerced into the college structures, notably, this Negative team never deals with the fact that student athletes are often coerced to go into these structures in the first place. It is only on side affirmative where we are able to prevent these athletes from ever entering into the harmful college system in the first place. Only us incentivizes the leagues themselves or the individuals in these leagues to go towards the professional leagues. And it is only us that allows these student athletes to become better. They try and say that we're making these athletes force a big trade-off in that they might have to give up their education, they might have to give up these other things that they might care very much about in going to college. But we can test whether or not this was a big priority for these students in the first place. Because of the reasons we give you. Most students who go into student sports leagues go for the reason of sports. It's not clear and was never actually established from this affirmative Negative team whether or not the incentives of students were to deal with these other parts of college. When it is clear that this is not the case, it is unclear that the trade-off they were ever trying to characterize for these students was ever as large as they claim it to be. And so when we recognize that the students we were really talking about were the ones who were trying to go pro, who were trying to ultimately make it in the big leagues, and were ultimately trying to further their sports careers, it was unclear why sticking in a system that only cared about you for 2 or 3 years, that had incentives to underreport the extent to which they were harming you, and that ultimately often did cause you harm and did cause you harm insofar as it likely limited your ability to go pro. It was never clear why we shouldn't actually just de-professionalize these leagues, incentivize these students to go to leagues where they were going to be better treated. And that's ultimately why affirmative wins this debate.
Excellent, thank you very much. Can the recording please?
Yeah.
Excellent. Do we have the negating team?
You're here.
Excellent. So I see that the recording has started. I'm also very happy to give feedback either on the Zoom call or via Discord message. I'm also, if you're comfortable, willing to have that feedback be recorded as well, if that's something you want. But obviously that's a bit more personal, so you might choose to just click me a private message later on or during it and then just stop the recording. Neat. So I'll drive straight into the decision. So me and the trainee had the same result. So I also encourage you to go and talk to them. We both gave this debate to the negating team. So congratulations. And we thought that it was a relatively clear debate, starting a little bit more closely and then extending as the debate went on. So what I'm going to talk through then is firstly just what the two different teams stood for in this debate, what essentially the comparative was, and the different arbitration that teams did over what is the real comparative in this debate. And that then boils down to essentially one singular question, and that is that insofar as we believe that professionalism is something that is good, and we want to push people into professional structures, is having people going towards a development league or a G League or an academy better than having people remaining within a increasingly professionalized and increasingly professional university or college sports system. And I thought the way in which the criticisms operated both of those leagues, what the negating team was able to do is explain why many of the criticisms that the affirming team had of professionalization in general applied equally to both these leagues, or potentially even slightly more, but there are inherent benefits, mainly due to the ability of these university leagues to generate huge amounts of interest and attention, would therefore allow them to spread out and take advantage of many of the benefits of professionalism that the affirming team wanted to push people into just by getting them into otherwise professional leagues. So let's talk about the comparative first up. What the affirming team tells me is that they want de-professionalization, but that's not actually necessarily because they're opposed to professionalization. They merely believe that moving people into private leagues is going to be the most appropriate way to deal with people who are particularly good. And then it's better to have an amateur league for other people's sports that continues. And what the negating team told me is that they instead stand for full professionalization. There's an initial push from the affirming team to just point out many of the ways in which it's very difficult to professionalize these types of amateur or semi-professional university leagues. I'm not, however, convinced that it is more difficult than deprofessionalization for the purposes of a counter model. I believe that it is likely mutually exclusive. You obviously can't pursue those solutions at the same time. And while I would have liked much more specificity from the negating team as to what exactly measures they're going to put in place to counter each of the problems put up by the affirming team as to why it's difficult to professionalize these types of universities, particularly stuff like the culture of amateurism, why people might be more willing to accept lower pay, I'm nonetheless convinced that by and large, many of those problems are solved simply by professionalizing the league at the outset and making those expectations and norms of bargaining much more clear to the people. What then comes about is essentially a agreement between two of the teams that professionalism is quite good because the money that you get means that you have higher quality of sport, higher quality of treatment, and better lives for these players. And largely, I think teams agree that this means that there'll be the death of high-level college sports, because many of the best college players will jump into these new private leagues that are set up at lower levels or straight obviously into the big leagues, whereas there's going to be this new type of professionalized university scene. What this does mean, however, is some of the negating team's points actually retain significantly less benefit in this debate than if, though, that there was still that continuation of the university leagues at a high level. Because obviously material like the extension material from second negating about there being behind the scenes enticement, firstly, I'm unconvinced that it is good enticement, so something like to keep people within that league or that league surviving. And I'm just simply unclear why that type of level of enticement continues to the degree that high-level college sports is hollowed out to such a degree that there isn't necessarily a massive harm stemming from this. And then in terms of stuff like leverage, with high-level players being able to use leverage, I'm convinced that most of those high-level players have already left this university scene. So I'm a little bit unclear as to what exactly the marginal change in that material is. It really drives into one central claim, which is professionalism is good. We want to drive people toward all the benefits that the teams agree on. We have to compare the different types of professional structures that they would go into. And the reason why the negating team is able to win on that question is they explained to me that most of the criticisms migrate along to the minor leagues that the affirming team tells me is a better comparative. There's still going to be some short-termism that operates within that, because obviously they still lose the player up into higher leagues if those players do particularly well. There's equally a pushback effect just on the degree to which short-termism operates within the university leagues. Obviously, you want to try and retain someone for 4 years rather than doing a one-and-done player like Zion Williams, where you sacrifice their initial health in order for them to have performance, leading to them being extracted from that league earlier than they otherwise could, which I think blunts some of the degree to short-termism. Either way, I think it's roughly symmetrical. In terms of scrutiny, which is the other major advantage that is pushed by the affirming team as the difference between those leagues, I think that's to some degree implicitly rebutted when they tell me that no one cares about these new leagues that people go to, and they point to the fact that the G League is likely not going to be particularly popular or isn't particularly well followed compared to the university leagues. But I also think this means that the reputation material that the negating team wants to raise as to why you would care for players and take care of players is also something that I think is likely symmetrical, because obviously if you're treating players poorly and they don't want to enter your program, I can see no conceptual reason why that doesn't extend to these types of minor leagues as opposed to just being universities. There's also a little bit of a push at NEG to say that there's going to be a huge flood of players. I'm not convinced this is necessarily true. These minor leagues wouldn't be able to expand in a way that is clear, but the structural degree of competition is one of the advantages that the negating team is able to bring. So let's talk about what the advantages the negating team claims happens within the G League. It says that you're able to preserve your education and your options over the time in which you're at university. I would have liked specific responses to the idea that when you enter a G League, you are open to new sports-related options, such as going into physio or operating at a high level. But if I am convinced that these amateur leagues, that these university leagues that are professionalized operate to a very high level, I don't necessarily believe that people are crowded out of that type of sports-related career options. And I do believe that they're likely to be crowded out of the educational options if they move outside of this university. So that's obviously a reason why people might prefer having this professional league tied into universities. I am convinced that it's likely to be a much richer league, and this I think is the most important material from NEG, because of the interest that uniquely exists around university sport. And I think they're able to prove to me that that stems from a connection with university sports that doesn't exist from the G League, the market of young university students you have access to, the alums that continue to be invested in the performance of those teams. And that just means that is the reason why there's such an interest and power within the way that college sports currently operates, making it naturally more professional, more able to take those advantages than these types of G Leagues. And finally, they're able to convince me that they're less likely to be crowded. So obviously you're only competing with a smaller group of individuals, young people who are going to university, rather than all of the other players who might use those development leagues, such as stars recovering from injury or older bit players who are trying to make a re-entry into the higher leagues. So there's going to be some crowding which disrupts the development and obviously means you take a smaller, higher level cut, and other people are unable to be moved into those leagues. The way in which the affirming team tries to respond to this is to explain that there's actually a trapping that happens within these semi-professional, professional leagues. To some degree, I think that trapping is, and stuff like exploitation is solved merely by having a professionalization of that league. Some issues like collusion with major leagues, I'm unclear why that applies uniquely to university rather than the new minor leagues that are likely to be set up. But there is some good analysis about why there are social pressures to get a good education, or simply the desire to operate with other good players who are also pressured into that environment, which means that players become trapped here against their interests. I'm mostly convinced that the reason why people prefer these university leagues is because it does meet their interests to want to go to university. Ned probably could have talked more about the college experience and why that is something that is so meaningful to a lot of young people, and they might really want to pursue that in a way that a G League doesn't provide. But I'm also agreed to some degree, and this narrows the margin a bit from the affirming team, that there are negative social pressures that push people towards university that they otherwise simply have no interest in, and they don't take advantage of things like the education that they are get. And so for a number of people, they're losing a significant, losing what was like a reasonable prospects that they have just going into that G League due to the way that they're funneled into those leagues. But I think that's a relatively minor trade-off. I'm further convinced by the negating team, and they proved to me that you're more likely actually to be disposable in these G Leagues because there's much more likely to be a greater degree of competition from other players and replacement that exists with them, and you're less likely to be supported by the fact that the school likes you as an educational environment. But once again, more could have been made from this. So for those higher level players, there's a significant disadvantage if they're pushed into things like G Leagues. There's also likely to be a mid-tier that kind of just gets shafted because they're competed out of these G Leagues. These people are less likely to benefit from the overall effect of just having a good college league, so they never get exposed to those better coaches, they never get exposed to the better treatment and better healthcare. I necessarily don't accept them going to be playing to the same degree anyway, so it kind of just shuts the option of ever having a professional career away from them. And obviously they might make money, but I think the economics of these leagues and why there might be subsidization of like those mid-tier players who otherwise wouldn't make it in professional leagues was a little bit unclear from the negating team. So I was wary to college that credit them particularly for that. There is some material from the affirming team that pushes back as like a positive defense of amateurism. They talk about college sports without the one and done players. But I think necessarily to the degree in which there's a significant siphoning that exists of college level sports, it is going to be something that is relatively minor in terms of deciding this overall debate. There were then a couple of further issues that I think the negating team attempted to make ground on and were promising, but weren't able to make ground on. For example, they pointed to the fact that there's going to be competition between the G League and the universities. I think this is a very clever argument. I also think it was quite clearly new at third negating, so I didn't credit it specifically. And equally, there was material at first negating to say that, well, when these sports deeply suck and now there's no money because the interest naturally dries up, you lose a lot of money that goes to subsidizing schools, it goes above money that subsidizes taxes. And I'm convinced to some degree, but this isn't weighed for me in any particular way by later speakers. So it doesn't shift the decision in any particular way. So that was the decision. Does anyone have any questions about the different issues that operate in this debate? Nope, if not, we can jump to personal feedback. Feel free to flick a message to say that you want it via Discord, or I'm very happy to do it now if teams are keen.
Hi, could the negating team ask for some feedback? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Affirming, would you like feedback as well?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind, Dan.